What if I told you that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is actually mentioned in the Bible? Yeah, you heard that right. This isn't some conspiracy theory or fringe idea. We're talking real verses, and I'm about to break it down for you. Let's start with Deuteronomy 18, verse 18, where God says, "I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him." Now, people have traditionally linked this prophecy to Jesus, but hold on for a second. Are we really sure that's the only interpretation? Because if we're talking about a prophet like Moses, we need to check the facts. Moses was not just a preacher or a teacher. He was a lawgiver, a leader, and a political figure. He established a new community, he led his people out of oppression, and most importantly, he brought down a complete law from God. Now compare that to Jesus, who was a spiritual leader, but not a lawgiver. Did Jesus bring a new legal system? No. He was more focused on transforming the heart and spirit, not laying down laws for society. Now look at Muhammad. He was a prophet, yes, but also a lawgiver, a leader who founded a new society based on divine law, or Sharia. He dealt with politics, warfare, community building, just like Moses did. So when the Bible says a prophet like Moses, doesn't Muhammad fit that description better than anyone else? And it gets even more interesting when we dive into John 14, verse 16, where Jesus says, "And I will pray the Father, and he will give you another comforter, that he may abide with you forever." Now, the word comforter in Greek is paraclete, but scholars have debated whether this could be a mistranslation or alteration of parakletos, which means praised one, and what does the name Muhammad mean? That's right, it literally means the praised one. You see where I'm going with this? Could it be that the Bible has been giving hints all along, but these hints were either misunderstood, mistranslated, or even ignored over the centuries? This isn't just some obscure theory. Early Christian and Jewish communities were actively waiting for another prophet after Jesus. And if you study their texts, there was always an expectation of someone else, someone who would bring a complete message. Now here's the kicker: Muhammad comes 600 years later, claiming to be that final prophet. That's not just a coincidence. He comes with a new law, a new revelation, exactly what Deuteronomy and other biblical texts seem to be pointing toward. Here's the question: if this is so obvious, why isn't it talked about more? Why is this connection brushed under the rug? Because admitting that Muhammad was mentioned in the Bible would shake the very foundation of Christian belief. This isn't about forcing one religion over the other. It's about looking at the texts with an open mind and asking the tough questions. Could the Bible really have been pointing to Muhammad all along? When you line up the characteristics, the mission, and the impact of Moses, Muhammad stands out as the true fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, let's get into something even more intriguing. After the time of Jesus, something critical was happening among both Jews and early Christians. Many of them were still expecting another prophet. Why? That's because despite everything, they knew the prophetic line wasn't done. The Messiah had come, yes, but the texts, the traditions, and the conversations kept pointing towards someone else, a final messenger who would complete the message. Take Isaiah 42, for instance. This chapter describes a mysterious servant of God, one who would bring justice to the nations, open the eyes of the blind, and free those trapped in darkness. Some Christian interpretations try to apply this to Jesus, but look closely, it doesn't quite fit. The description isn't about spiritual salvation, it's about justice on a global scale. This is someone who brings a new law, someone with a universal message for all nations, not just a specific group. And here's the wild part. If you look at early Jewish and Christian writings, this idea of a final prophet was common knowledge. It wasn't just speculation or fringe theory. The Jews were waiting for a prophet, like Moses, who would bring something fresh, something more than just spiritual renewal. The early Christians, many of them believed the same thing. But over time, these expectations started to shift. Now fast forward to 7th century Arabia, and here comes Muhammad, bringing a message that claims to fulfill the prophecies of the past. He's not claiming to break away from the tradition of the prophets before him, he's fulfilling it. And the message? It's not just for one group or one region, it's for everyone. That's exactly what Isaiah 42 was pointing toward. So what happened? Why didn't this expectation of a final prophet stay front and center in Christianity? Part of the answer lies in early church politics. After centuries of shaping doctrine, councils, and defining what was orthodox, any mention of another prophet threatened to destabilize the whole foundation. So those expectations? They were gradually minimized, overlooked, or straight up ignored. But if you take a step back and look at the broader picture, the pieces start to fit together. Prophecies weren't just some ancient texts to be locked away, they were signals, clues, about a final prophet who would come and wrap up the message of God to humanity. And history shows that many were still waiting for that prophet long after the time of Jesus. Now, how does this connect to Muhammad? Simple. He claimed to be that final prophet, and if you look at how the early Christians and Jews were interpreting their own texts, the expectation for someone exactly like Muhammad was already there. Did you know that some scholars argue Prophet Muhammad is not only referenced in the Bible, but his actual name may have been present in early Christian texts? This isn't some wild theory, this is based on a deep dive into the original languages and texts, and it's enough to make you rethink everything. In John 16 verse 7, Jesus promises that after he departs, the Paraclete will come. Most translations refer to this as the Comforter or the Advocate. But here's the twist. Some scholars believe that the word used in the original texts wasn't Paraclete at all. They suggest the original word could have been Parakletos, which means praised one. Now, what does Muhammad mean? It literally translates to the praised one in Arabic. Now, ask yourself, why would the original meaning of this word matter? Because if the original text did indeed use Parakletos instead of Paraclete, then we're talking about a direct reference to Muhammad by name. The praised one. That's not some vague metaphor or obscure title, it's specific. And that changes the whole narrative. But why would this have been altered? We know from historical evidence that early Christian texts went through numerous edits, revisions, and translations, especially during the process of standardizing Christian doctrine. Is it possible that this was one of those changes? A subtle shift that helped align the text with the emerging Christian orthodoxy, while sidelining any mention of a future prophet that didn't fit their narrative. If the name Ahmed, or Muhammad, was in the early texts, it means there was a deliberate shift away from acknowledging what was clearly foretold. You see, in Surah As-Saf 61:6, the Quran mentions that Jesus foretold the coming of a messenger named Ahmed, another name for Muhammad. And while many might dismiss this, historical linguistics might just back this up. Here's the big question. Why aren't more people talking about this? Why isn't this front page news in religious studies? Because it shakes things up. It suggests that not only did early Christians know about Muhammad, but they might have even tried to suppress that knowledge as the church grew and solidified its teachings. And that's the point. History isn't always clean. Sometimes what we think we know is shaped by centuries of editing, omission, and revision. So when you hear that the Paraclete was supposed to come after Jesus, and then you find out that word might have actually been Parakletos, the praised one, you've got to start asking serious questions. Let's shift gears and dive straight into one of the biggest debates in biblical prophecy, Deuteronomy 18, verse 18. Now, I know what you're thinking. This verse has been discussed a million times, right? Well, not like this. Because when it says that God will raise up a prophet like Moses, we need to stop and ask a tough question. Who actually fits the description? Here's the thing. Most people have been taught that this prophecy is about Jesus. But when you take a closer look, the details don't quite line up. Moses was a lawgiver, a leader, and a political figure. He wasn't just leading a spiritual revival, he was running an entire nation, laying down laws and guiding his people through some of the toughest challenges they ever faced. Now, compare that with Jesus. Yes, Jesus was a transformative spiritual figure, but he didn't establish a legal code or create a new political system. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. His mission was different. But when you look at Muhammad, things start to get real interesting. Muhammad wasn't just a prophet, he was a leader of a nation. He brought a legal code and he united an entire people. That's exactly what Moses did. The parallels are striking, and this is where we need to dig deeper. Why is this connection overlooked? Here's what the text says. God promises to raise a prophet from among their brethren. Now, let's break that down. Brethren doesn't necessarily mean from the exact same lineage as the Israelites. It could mean from their brothers, like the descendants of Ishmael. And who do we know as the descendants of Ishmael? The Arabs. The link is undeniable, yet it's rarely talked about. This prophecy, according to many Islamic scholars, was never fully fulfilled by Jesus. Why? Because Jesus didn't come as a military leader. He didn't bring down a new law for the people to live by. He came with a message of spiritual renewal. And that's important, but it's not the same role Moses played. Now look at Muhammad. He brought a complete legal system, Sharia, which transformed the Arabian Peninsula and later much of the world. He wasn't just a preacher, he was a legislator, a ruler, a warrior, and a unifier. In fact, in terms of impact and leadership, Muhammad resembles Moses far more than Jesus does, at least in the way both interacted with the societies they led. So, if you're going to take the prophecy seriously, you've got to admit it fits Muhammad far more clearly than any other figure in history. When you start to connect the dots, it becomes clear that the Torah's prophecy might not have been fulfilled until Muhammad came on the scene. But because of centuries of tradition and interpretation, this connection has been largely ignored or dismissed by mainstream religious teaching. Let's dig into something that often gets pushed to the side when talking about biblical prophecy: Ishmael's lineage. Now, most people are familiar with the story of Isaac, the chosen line through which the Israelites came. But what about Ishmael, the other son of Abraham? Why is his story rarely talked about, especially when it comes to the legacy of prophethood? Genesis is pretty clear that God had big plans for Ishmael too. In Genesis 17 verse 20, God says, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard you who behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation." Now, we're not talking about just any random blessing here. God himself promises to make Ishmael's descendants a great nation. This isn't a footnote in history, it's a massive statement. If Ishmael was blessed to become a great nation, what happened? Who were his descendants? And why don't we hear much about this great nation in traditional biblical teachings? According to both biblical and Islamic traditions, Ishmael is the forefather of the Arab people, and through his line came none other than Prophet Muhammad. That's right. The great nation promised in Genesis is none other than the Arab nation, and Muhammad stands as the most significant figure from that lineage. But for centuries, this connection has been buried under theological bias. Mainstream interpretations often focus solely on Isaac's descendants, but Ishmael was never forgotten in God's covenant. The Bible itself recognizes his importance, and it's clear that his descendants were destined for greatness. So why the silence? When you connect the dots, it becomes clear the Arab nation, through Ishmael, was promised something extraordinary, and Muhammad emerges as the culmination of that promise. He's the leader who united the descendants of Ishmael, brought a message that transformed the world, and fulfilled the biblical prophecy of a great nation rising from Ishmael's line. Now, we get into something that most people haven't heard about, the Gospels we don't have. That's right, I'm talking about the Gnostic texts, the lost books, and the early Christian writings that never made it into the Bible. Why is this important? Because some of these texts might hold the key to understanding a hidden truth, references to a prophet who would come after Jesus. And that prophet could very well be Muhammad. Here's what we know. Early Christianity wasn't as unified as we think today. There were multiple groups, each with different ideas about who Jesus was and what his message meant. Some of these groups, like the Gnostics, had texts that didn't make it into the canon. Why? Because these texts didn't align with the official church's teachings as they were trying to solidify their power. Now, what if some of these lost texts actually mentioned a prophet coming after Jesus? What if these early Christian communities were waiting for someone who fit the description of Muhammad? There's evidence that suggests exactly that, and the fact that these texts were suppressed should make us all a little suspicious. The Gospel of Barnabas, for example, which didn't make it into the Bible, contains references to a prophet after Jesus. Scholars argue that this gospel has traces of Islamic influence, possibly because it was written or preserved by early Christians who had knowledge of Muhammad's coming. It speaks directly of a messenger who would continue the work of Jesus, much like the Quran describes Muhammad as the final messenger. But here's the real kicker. The process of creating the New Testament wasn't as simple as collecting a bunch of texts. It was a political process, and anything that didn't fit the established doctrine was thrown out or labeled heretical. And in this process, the idea of a final prophet after Jesus was likely silenced, buried under centuries of theological decisions. It's so When we talk about lost gospels and hidden truths, we're not just talking about ancient texts. We're talking about entire narratives that were pushed aside, and within those forgotten stories, we may find the very evidence that points to Muhammad as the fulfillment of prophecies that mainstream Christianity chose to ignore. It's not a stretch to believe that early Christian communities knew about Muhammad's coming, but that over time, this knowledge was erased or forgotten. The lost gospels hold more than just alternative views of Jesus. They potentially hold the missing link that connects Christianity and Islam in ways that would change everything we've been taught. Now that we've uncovered all these layers, we've got to ask ourselves, what does this mean for us today? If Prophet Muhammad was truly mentioned in the Bible, if early Christians and Jews were waiting for a prophet like him, and if the Bible itself hints at his coming, then we're standing on the edge of a revelation that could reshape the way we see not just history, but the very future of interfaith dialogue. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are often seen as competing narratives, each claiming to hold the ultimate truth. But what if, instead of seeing these faiths as fundamentally opposed, we start to recognize the continuity between them? After all, the Quran teaches that Muhammad wasn't sent to destroy or replace previous messages. He was sent as the seal of the prophets, the final link in a chain of divine revelation that started with Adam and stretched through Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. If we accept the possibility that Muhammad is mentioned in the Bible, then it opens the door to a reconciliation of these faiths, something that hasn't been fully explored. Think about it. The Bible and the Quran could be seen not as competing texts, but as two parts of the same story. Both speak about God's message to humanity, and both emphasize the importance of righteousness, justice, and mercy. But here's the catch. Recognizing Muhammad as part of the biblical narrative would challenge centuries of religious tradition. Religious institutions have built their teachings around the idea that their narrative is the complete and final one. For many Christians, the idea of another prophet coming after Jesus challenges the core of their beliefs. For Jews, the idea that a prophet could rise from the line of Ishmael rather than Isaac presents a major shift in understanding. Yet, in the modern world, where we're constantly confronted with religious conflict, this revelation could be a game changer. Imagine what could happen if Christians, Jews, and Muslims began to see their faiths as interconnected rather than in competition. Instead of arguing over who holds the real truth, we could start to recognize that all three faiths are pieces of the same divine puzzle, each offering a unique perspective on the same God, the same message, and the same purpose. Let's be clear, this isn't about diluting religious identity or blending faiths into some vague feel-good spirituality. It's about acknowledging historical truth and theological continuity. If we take seriously the idea that Muhammad was foretold in the Bible, then we can't ignore the fact that all these religions are part of a shared legacy. And that legacy isn't just some ancient history, it's alive today, in the beliefs and practices of billions of people. But here's the real challenge. Can religious leaders and communities accept this possibility? Can they step outside their doctrinal boxes and explore the potential for a new understanding? Or will they continue to hold on to divisions that, frankly, don't make sense in light of the historical and scriptural evidence we've uncovered? This is where it gets personal. If you're watching this right now, you've probably grown up with a certain set of beliefs, whether that's Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or something else. But what if the truth is bigger than any one of these labels? What if we've been missing the bigger picture? The idea that God sent not just one messenger but a series of them, each building on the last, leading up to a final prophet who was meant to unite the world under a single divine message. Now, I know this isn't an easy thing to accept. Centuries of tradition, culture, and identity are wrapped up in these religious beliefs. But we have to ask ourselves, is the truth worth the discomfort of rethinking what we've always been taught? Are we willing to take a step back, look at the evidence, and see where it leads us, even if that means changing our perspective? Because here's the reality: if the Bible truly points to Muhammad, then it means we've been living with incomplete knowledge. And that's not something to fear, that's something to explore. It doesn't mean abandoning your faith or your beliefs. It means expanding them, deepening them, and understanding them in a way that's more connected to the truth of the past. So, where do we go from here? The implications of what we've uncovered aren't just theological, they're deeply practical. They have the potential to reshape interfaith dialogue in a world that desperately needs more understanding, more unity, and less division. Whether you're a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim, these revelations could help us build a bridge between these faiths, a bridge that's been overlooked for far too long. But here's the thing, it starts with you. It starts with questioning the narrative you've been handed, digging into the text yourself, and being open to what you find. Because this isn't just about religious leaders or scholars. It's about everyday people, people like you, who are ready to challenge the status quo and seek the truth, no matter where it leads. And that's where we leave it. You've got the information, you've got the connections, now it's up to you to dive deeper. The shocking truth is that the world's religions might not be as divided as we think. In fact, they could be part of a much larger, much more interconnected story than we ever imagined.